Morning. How are you getting on? Okay, so we'll give it a few minutes before we get started. Um, I want to check, first of all, that you're okay for submitting your work by the deadline this afternoon, and I can give you some more time or some more help with that during this morning if that's useful. I know people have been having problems with large file sizes, and so I've got some suggestions for sorting out those kinds of things if you need it. Okay, great. Hi, Les. So the most common problem, I was speaking to Matt Bellingham this morning about it. The most common problem is large video file sizes, um, and making them kind of slow to upload or not uploading at all because they're so large. So I would probably start by uploading anything smaller first of all. So anything like PD patches, any text file or slides you have, I'd upload those first, get those in there. And then it's likely to be video that's the issue. And so video, you could try compressing it, but very happy to take the video part as a submission in the comments if that's useful. You could host it in something like Google Drive or Dropbox if that helps. It won't have the same limit as Canvas's file size limit. Yeah, if you let me know what problems you're having, we'll try and find a solution this morning. Morning, Lewis. Okay, what we'll do to start with is, so let me know if you do have any problems with submitting your assignment and what they are. If you don't, I'm just going to get you to fill in the mid-module evaluation before we get started. So it's the same kind of thing as you'll get in other modules. And if you just want to select 5 from U18 for it. And so it's just a couple of questions about the module so far. And this is obviously my first session, so it'll be interesting for me as well. I'm just going to pop the link into the chat, and it's just a Google form if you want to spend a couple of minutes just filling that in. If you're sorting out your submission, very happy for you to do it later. It's really useful to have that information at some point. If you just want to confirm that you can access the mid-module evaluation form too, that would be great. It's shared from Matt's Drive, so I just need to check that you can get into it okay. Okay, yeah, you might find, how big is your file, just out of interest, Les? Okay, no problem. Morning, Dan. So let me know if you have any problems submitting your assignment, Dan. Things like large file sizes being slow or impossible to upload into Canvas, particularly large video. We'll think of some solutions. And if you're okay with submitting your work or it's already submitted, I've just popped the module evaluation, the mid-module evaluation form into the chat. It'd be great if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill that in. And then we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Morning. Got a couple of new people in. And okay, so yeah, we'll get started in a moment. Let me know if you've got any problems with submitting your first assignment, particularly things like large file sizes. Usually large video file sizes can cause problems, and we'll try and sort those out. And if you haven't got any submission problems, if you could take a moment to fill out the mid-module evaluation just at this link. And it's shared from Matt's Google Drive, so just let me know that you can get into it. That would be great. Should only take a short amount of time to do. So 641 megabytes. Yeah, so it's not that large. It must be a slow upload. But yeah, my suggestion is upload it to Drive, share the link into the comments of Canvas, and put your PD patch or patches, upload those into Canvas itself, and then yeah, pop your hosted video file, the larger one, into the comments, and you'll still be within the deadline if it's 3 hours. It'll probably speed up as well. It usually predicts longer than it's going to take at the start. So check back and check that it's uploading in about half an hour or so, and you should have a more accurate ETA on it being fully uploaded. Yeah, some home internet connections have a much slower upload speed than download. I have it here. My download is like 200 megabits a second. My upload is about 2. So I can download all the stuff in the world, but uploading takes me an age. So the deadline is 2 p.m. today. So if you check in Canvas, you should see, at least for most people, some people will have extensions and automatic extensions, but the deadline for most people is 2 p.m. this afternoon. And it should be 2 p.m. across all of your tech modules. We don't get to set the assessments in Canvas anymore. Registry do it. I don't know why they picked 2 p.m., but they picked 2 p.m. On the day of submission for all of the modules. Yeah, and let's yeah, with the Word document in there, put any PD patches in there as well, straight in, as they should be very small, not take very long to upload. And then down the right-hand side of Canvas, you've got the comments box where we usually put your feedback. And so pop the link to your Google Drive file, your large video file in there when it's uploaded. That's my suggestion. It won't overwrite anything then, and it should be really clear that's what it is. If anyone else has similar issues, that's what I suggest as well. Make sure you submit the smaller files straight into Canvas. But anything else that's larger that might need to be hosted in Google Drive, Dropbox, pop it into the comments on the right-hand side of Canvas. The place where we usually put your grade and feedback and so on. Just paste the shared link. Make sure it's an open access link so we can freely access it. And obviously don't delete the files for a while as we need to mark it and so on. But that should hopefully solve most of the common problems that we get. Okay, so I think we'll get started because we can always come back to some of these things when we have a break. And we'll try to take it easy today. And obviously assessment days are always a bit stressful and I don't want to add to that stress. So we'll leave plenty of time for sorting out things as we go along. Just in case you missed it, yeah, the mid-module evaluation point is kind of last week or this week. We've chosen to do it this week, and it's really useful, particularly for me, but also for Matt. Some modules you have one member of staff taking every session. We have a mixture of staff on this module, and so it's really handy to see how you've been getting on. And the mid-module evaluation helps us with that. Anything you're worried about, anything you particularly like, it's really handy to pop in there, and hopefully it only takes a couple of minutes to do that. Today's session, yeah, as well as sorting out any problems you might have and just anything that you want to ask me about that you might have done previously, we're going to focus on what's called West Coast synthesis. I'm just going to restart my camera, as I don't know why it cut out, but it did. Be back in a second. Okay, so immediately behind me, there's a modular synthesizer, and I'm going to use that for a couple of things. And I'll move between pure data, VCV rack, and yeah, perhaps the modular synth behind me when it's appropriate. It turns out that the teaching with modular synth is quite tricky, and so I'll use it to kind of supplement the other things that we're doing rather than make it the main thing. But I'll show you in hardware some of the things we do in software, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'll try and use the software that's most appropriate or most eloquent for doing particular tasks. So when I'm talking about kind of fine details, I'll probably focus in on pure data. And when I'm talking about larger things or showing you an alternative, I'll talk about VCV rack. But I'll show you the same kind of things in both softwares. Yeah, and where I can, I'll show you also on the modular synth. As see, both softwares, pure data and VCV, are derived from hardware originally. So it's kind of cool to see. I've put together some resources for today. So the idea is you don't have to kind of learn everything in a couple of hours. So you might want to take in things more gently. And to help you do that, as well as the slides for today, I'm just going to put a link to a copy of the slides. I've put together some resources for you that you might find useful afterwards. You can take them in at a more gentle pace. So there's a mixture of text, video, images that show you how to create various things that we'll look at today. And hopefully they'll be useful. Okay, so the slides I've put together in a few different formats. So I'll give you the Google Drive link, and I can also give you a PDF link if that's useful too. The advantage of having access to the slides directly is that you can access the various links that are embedded. Okay, so The slides are just there in the chat, and I'll just grab a PDF copy in case that's your preferred format. Okay. So take your pick of whichever format you want, the Google Doc version or the PDF version just below it. But it'll probably be useful to have your own downloaded copy as well as seeing the screen. Okay, so we will get started by just having a look at some extra resources you might find useful. So some of these are very recent. One is from last night that I just happened to come across and thought it was interesting. And at this point in the module, we turn towards assignment 2, which is kind of further developing what you've done for assignment 1 and applying it to some kind of musical context, some kind of musical thing that you make. So it's kind of taking synthesizer or effect thing that you've produced, perhaps developing it some more, but also, yeah, kind of using it to create some music in the broadest sense. Can be in combination with your more usual way of working, perhaps. But the idea is we kind of put some sort of thing you've made related to synthesis or processing into a kind of musical application. Today, we're going to focus primarily on West Coast synthesis. I'll explain what that involves, why it's a bit of a misleading term, but it's still useful. Yeah, hopefully it'll be a little bit different to the kinds of things we've looked at before. It's not wedded to a particular synthesis technique. It's more an ethos that combines a range of techniques, and you can use it to add to what you've done before, or you can use the range of techniques to add to what you've done before, and you can make all sorts of interesting things. Okay, so just going to move my slide on. And yeah, these are just some general things that I find useful. It's quite a range of things here. So in Keith Fullerton Whitman's YouTube channel, I'll pop the link in the chat as well. There is a collection of 400, I think now, rare electronic music albums, records, a lot of which you simply can't find anywhere else. So it's a bit of a treasure trove. So this is his channel. It's a bit of a treasure trove of electronic music, particularly synthesis recordings. And there's all sorts of stuff even I've not seen there before. Lots of things that are out of print. Yeah, and very few copies around. So it's worth having a listen to some of those. I'd probably just start and pick at random anything that takes your fancy. It's all quite obscure, but there's some really nice stuff in there. Using additive synthesis, subtractive synthesis, FM, and so on in a musical context. The other thing that I find quite useful is UbuWeb. So UbuWeb is a long-running archive founded about 20 years ago. It was one of the first things one of the places to document the arts online, grown into quite an extensive archive of everything really from the visual arts through to sound art, film, and again, there's all kinds of rare stuff there, and it's got a dedicated electronic music section, which, as you can imagine, is quite synthesizer heavy. So if you're looking for inspiration of the kind of things you can do with synthesis and processing, these two are a really good place to start. The other resources we'll come back to towards the end because they'll make more sense a little bit later on. Okay, I'm just going to start recording now, so I'll try not to swear, otherwise I'll capture it for posterity. Okay, and we'll make it available after. So anything you're unsure about, you can come back to. Okay, so when we talk about West Coast synthesis, it's in reference to the West Coast of the US. And I'll explain why West Coast is an important concept. And it relates to both something very valid and something that's kind of a populist oversimplification of the facts. But really, there's always been, in lots of areas, an interest in seeing the United States in particular in terms of its coasts. Particularly in popular culture, it's a commonly occurring thing. So, did anyone catch the recent US election? Or some of the coverage of it? Yeah, it was everywhere, and and still is to some extent. So it's in the US election coverage, you get a similar kind of obsession with the coasts, and it's a way of simplifying what's quite a complex picture. The difference is in politics, the coasts are politically quite similar. You can see that they tend to vote Democrat on the West Coast and the East Coast. But in music, so we get it in rap music. We get a host of kind of loosely associated East Coast rappers with completely different stylistic traits to the West Coast. And the media kind of blew up this war between the two. And in a less violent way, we get the same distinction being made with synthesis. So on the East Coast, we get Bob Moog. And on the West Coast, we get Don Buchla and his instrument. And it's kind of caught on as a way of seeing synthesizers and synthesis because these two instruments happened at around the same time in the 60s. They were developed in isolation from each other, so they ended up being, to a significant extent, different. I'll show you that that's not quite the case. You can actually do a lot of things with both of them that are similar to the other side. But it's kind of a popular myth. And it stems from this tendency to split the United States by coast in popular culture. So it's just a little bit of background to it. And the first thing I want to add is that this idea of East and West Coast, so you've got a dividing line down here, is actually, it's not as even a split as you might imagine. Moog was working on the East Coast, but around the same time, maybe a couple of years later, on the West Coast, as well as Buchla, you have the Russian-American designer Serge Terepin, which I've probably terribly mispronounced. But this guy on the right with his Serge synthesizer system, and he was also exploring similar ideas to Buchla. So although we often see West Coast synthesis as being just Buchla, in reality, Serge is in there as well. And Serge is still alive today. He's a bit younger than the other two, who have both now died. And Serge is still active. He's still working and talking and all those other things. So he's a bit like a piece of living history. We'll talk about some of the finer differences between these two and show you. But generally, what we refer to as East Coast is typically just Bob Moog. And what we refer to as West Coast is Buchla plus Serge. The Serge system until recently was lesser known, but it's pretty renowned. Okay, so this is what we're talking about in terms of instrument. Has anyone seen either or both of these systems before? Yeah, great. Most people have seen this one, maybe a bigger version of it. It's modular, so it's kind of available in all sorts of versions. But not everyone has seen the Buchla counterpart. And again, it might look a bit different, but you see, first of all, one's a black panel, one's typically white panel. So this is an early Moog modular. What, when commercially produced, became the Model 15. And this is the Buchla 100 series music box. And the 100 series was commercially produced as well, in smaller numbers than the Moog, because they were handmade. But both were commercially available by 1964. So those are the physical instruments we're talking about. But really what we're interested in today is the techniques that they embody. Okay, and then I mentioned that Serge, his synthesizer system comes under West Coast. And so this is what a Serge synthesizer looks like. You may not have seen the Serge before. It's not so commonly seen in the literature, but we'll come back to this as it's got some interesting ideas in it. I describe the difference between the Buchla and the Serge as being like the difference between Lego and Duplo. So Lego is like a small building block, of course, that you can build almost anything out of from a series of small parts. And that's a lot like the Serge. Each module is like an atom of sound generation, and you combine these atoms together to make something complicated, but each individual module is actually quite simple. But by patching them together in different ways, you can make things that are really sophisticated. The Buchla, on the other hand, although it can produce similar kinds of sounds, it's more like Duplo in that it's a building block system. It's modular, and you patch it together, but the building blocks are bigger. So instead of lots of different modules to make an oscillator, the Buchla has a big block that's a complex oscillator that can do all sorts of things. And in that sense, the Serge is more like pure data, where we're working with small objects and patching smaller objects together to do something. The Buchla is more like VCV rack, where we have modules that combine a number of building blocks in one module. And that's quite a nice way to think about it. So this is a little bit like VCV rack. This is more like pure data's approach. And I think the key thing is that there's no real right or wrong, better or worse way of doing it. Everything is suited to, or more suited to, a specific range of tasks. And so the ideal is that you have a range of tools available, and you can kind of transfer concepts across those tools, and you use the tool that's best suited to the job. It's something that takes time to develop, but is a really nice way of working in the end. There are things in VCV Rack that I can do in a minute that take me, I don't know, like days or worse to do in pure data. And there are things that I can do in pure data really quickly that it drives me insane trying to get VCV Rack to do. And it's kind of knowing what one thing does well compared to another thing, and yeah, kind of switching between the tools. And it's the same in hardware. So if these two West Coast instruments do different things well, you can imagine compared to this East Coast instrument, again, there's more differences there. Some things are much easier on the Moog than they are on the Buchla or they are on the Serge. So throughout electronic music, there's been a tendency for certain styles of music to favour one instrument over the other. But in reality, you can kind of force both instruments to, or both sides of these instruments to do similar things if you have to. It might involve kludges, workarounds, things that aren't necessarily easy to do. But if you have a thing you want to do, you can usually do it on this instrument just as much as on this side. And I'll show you some example recordings to try and bring that to life. Okay, so yeah, we have this idea of East versus West Coast synthesis. And of course, it is an oversimplification. It is a kind of catchy way to remember the difference. And most instruments, particularly contemporary instruments, can do both philosophies of synthesis, both palettes of technique. On my synthesizer, it can do a mixture of both fairly comfortably. And the instruments always could. Even back in the 60s, they weren't as limited as you may imagine. Yeah, I've mentioned that we've missed out surge in the popular take on West Coast synthesis. But the reason that I think it's still a valid concept is that it enables us to think about some different ways of doing sound synthesis, think about some different user interfaces, and think about some different synthesis techniques. And so it's a flawed distinction between the two, but hopefully a useful one. And hopefully it will feel a little bit different to the techniques that you've learned in the module so far, because we're not thinking about a specific technique like subtractive synthesis or additive synthesis or FM. We're thinking more about a range of things that are useful for as part of your workflow. Okay, so there's lots of things that now explicitly combine East and West Coast ideas. I just wanted to add. So this is the middle path VCO, and so even in its name, it tries to imply that it's got ideas from Moog alongside ideas from Buchla. And in this case, it's that it combines subtractive synthesis and a mixer for blending those waveforms together. So down here, you can see a range of waveforms down here. And then on the West Coast side, you've got things like wave shaping built in. You've got oscillator sync. And the idea is that you use wave shaping, you use essentially distorting the simpler waveforms along with frequency modulation to create complex sounds. So this idea of East versus West Coast has even made it into synthesizer design. There's also the zero coast or no coast by Make Noise, which is a small little portable synthesizer that's quite popular at the moment. But yeah, it's not just in teaching that these ideas of East and West Coast pop up. So look at some key differences between kind of East Coast flavored synthesis, Moog flavored synthesis, and West Coast flavored synthesis of Buchla and Surge. Okay, and the differences are really rooted in who the original instruments were aimed at. Does anyone know the background to the Moog synthesizer? Do you know how it was invented or why it was invented and who it was originally for? Or have you just seen the Moog modular, but you're not really sure how it was created or why it was created? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so the composer, absolutely right, was a guy called Herb Dutch, who was a part-time academic, but really he was a commercial music composer. And the Moog modular actually existed as the idea of a portable recording studio. So that was Moog's idea for it. I've made this portable recording studio to sell to universities and schools because a regular recording studio is some massive, expensive thing that not many people can afford. And once you've got it, it's a nightmare because it fills a room and you can't do anything else with it. So the Moog modular, the prototype, and his original kind of sales pitch was as a studio in a box to replace the traditional recording studio. He started talking to his friend, Herb Dutch, and Dutch was telling him, like, you've got to include a keyboard because the market for this isn't a replacement studio. It's as a replacement for commercial music ensembles. So Dutch kind of invented the ADSR envelope as well in similar discussions. But really the important thing that he did for Bob Moog was convince him to include the keyboard as standard. And the Dutch's idea that Moog took up was that the Moog modular would replace an orchestra or orchestral musicians in commercial music sessions for adverts. And so, although this thing was really expensive compared to hiring an orchestra day after day, eventually it could save you some money. And that was really the driving force behind the Moog modular as we know it. Buchla, on the other hand, were the 100 series music box was a commission from the San Francisco Tape Music Center, which was really a cooperative with 4 quite well-known San Francisco composers in it. And they wanted a synthesizer made for their specific needs for the center. Morton Subotnick, Pauline Oliveros are the 2 most well-known. Morton Subotnick is still playing now. He's like 85 and he's playing live using Ableton. I saw him last year. It was amazing. It's like a living bit of history. But the Buchla was commissioned, by the San Francisco Tape Music Center for their specific compositional needs. And they were experimental music composers. And so that's the key difference. Buchla made an experimental music box first and foremost. Moog ended up making something for commercial musicians. And so the keyboard of the Moog relates to that intention to play primarily melodic music. The Buchla doesn't come with a keyboard, as we'll see, because it wasn't necessarily meant to be writing tunes. It was more for shaping sounds in a more experimental way. And the Surge, as I mentioned before, is similar to the Buchla, but with smaller pieces that you add together, combine together to do interesting things. And the Surge was more like the Buchla in that it too didn't come with the traditional keyboard. So these 2 are for sonic experimentation primarily, or by intention. The Moog is primarily for playing more melodic music. That you can make either side do either thing is something I'll come to in a minute with some examples. But those were the intentions of their designers. Okay, so as well as the piano or organ-like keyboard, more organ-like in that it's not velocity sensitive typically on a Moog instrument. We won't focus on the keyboard too much because we're interested in the synthesis primarily, but it's just important to note that it's there. But we get an assumption that subtractive synthesis is going to be the basis of our workflow with the Moog instrument. So it's not to say subtractive synthesis is the only thing you can do, but the Moog is kind of assuming, if you like, assuming as part of its design that you're going to be doing mostly subtractive synthesis. You've got this kind of workflow as part of the subtractive model. You're familiar with these ideas of subtractive synthesis from the earlier weeks? Probably. Just to check, you've seen this kind of diagram of subtractive synthesis before? Yeah, great. Yeah, just wanted to check. So I won't spend too much time going over this other than to say subtractive synthesis make a complex sound here by mixing relatively simple waveforms, maybe modulating them with some LFOs. And then you've got usually a resonant low pass filter. And the biggest effect on the sound is from the resonant low pass filter. You've got keyboard control often, and you've got ADSR envelopes that respond to the keyboard. Okay, so I won't go over that too much. And of course, when we're talking subtractive synthesis, we've usually got multiple oscillators. So we might have 3, 4, 5 oscillators, all contributing to that kind of rich sound source that we then filter. So it's quite tricky to fit on a diagram, but this is essentially that. And this is just expanded to show that you might have more than one oscillator there. Waveforms like sawtooth, square get used because of their harmonic content being suitable for filtering afterwards. Okay. The subtractive synthesis tends to make kind of rich bass, brassy, can be quite aggressive, kind of chunky sounds. If I had to describe a typical subtractive synthesis sound, it's it's kind of fat, it's kind of heavy, and then you might use the filter then to shape that to add squelchiness. I'm thinking of all sorts of stuff like an Aphex Twin bass line, using an SH101 synthesizer as being kind of classic subtractive synthesis. And we're using usually a series of oscillators, at least a couple, that might look like this. So you've got some coarse pitch control, a fine pitch control, and you've got a number of different waveforms. Yeah, and then we're just summing the multiple oscillators together before we get to the filter. Okay, so let's think of that in terms of sound. So this is just a reference point for what's coming after. This is as typical a subtractive synthesis example as I could find. Just grab the link for you. Okay, so I'm just going to mute my mic while I play this video so I don't get anything horrific happening with the audio. Okay, so just a brief example of some. Okay, just a brief example of some typical subtractive synthesis. You've got a noise source being filtered. You've got some fat oscillators being filtered and modulated, and then putting that together into some kind of musical track. You'll notice that it's in this kind of expensive looking wooden case. This is a late 60s example of a Moog modular, and the case and the keyboard were designed to be appealing to quite conservative commercial musicians. So you get something that looks a bit like a piece of fine furniture. It's kind of wrapping the newness in a less scary case. And it's a purposeful design choice. But yeah, sound-wise, just a fairly typical example of the kinds of things you might do with this sort of system. Different kinds of filters for extracting different spectral components from noise sources and oscillators and so on. Okay. And if you want to hear a little bit more about Bob Moog's ideas, we're lucky that there's quite a lot of interviews, and other first-hand sources with Bob Moog. We'll compare that with the information available about Buchla and things involving Buchla himself in a moment. But there's lots and lots of stuff out there on subtractive synthesis via Moog, and you can hear a little bit about his philosophies and so on. But I've tried to sum them up. There's a great film by Hans Falstead. If you haven't caught it yet, it's freely available on YouTube, and you can hear some of the musicians who used a Moog as well as Moog himself talking. What I'll focus on for this part is some of the classic recordings that feature a Moog modular. So 1964, the Moog modular becomes commercially available. They're really expensive, like they're more than a house. Just, in terms of today's money, you could get comfortably a house for the cost of one of these things in 1964-65. So it takes a couple of years for word to get out about what it is and what it can do, because for most people, this is like magic. For most people, this is something they haven't seen before. Hardly anyone has a synthesizer, but the first synthesizers that people do get, and these are wealthy musicians, record companies may be buying them for the bigger bands. Some producers have one, but it's people with significant income. But you don't really see universities, certainly in the States, a few universities, but we're probably talking, I don't know, like 5 universities initially in the US. The first Indian Moog happened in 1968, but it's only because a musician who was really into them went to India with one because he was really into Indian food, and he took one with him and left it there. The UK, Rolling Stones had a Moog modular. George Harrison of the Beatles played with one, but I don't think any universities did in the UK for perhaps until the late 60s, 1970 even. So a few places in the US did, and no doubt a few others around the world, but we're talking really small numbers. And then like the biggest artists of the time might have had one, but they didn't really know what to do with it. So we get the Monkees, who were essentially an American boy band, at least at first. They became a bit more serious after, but they were one of the first manufactured bands. They had a TV show promoting themselves, a bit like reality TV, but in the 60s. And so it featured on a couple of their early tracks, simply because they thought it was cool, and they were so fashionable at the time. Either they or their record company were able to buy one that they could play around with. And so on what's nominally a boy band record, i.e. a manufactured pop record, you get one of the first recorded instances of a Moog modular. So I'll just grab a link to that. I'll start with Daily Nightly by the Monkees, just because I slightly prefer it to the other track. Feel free to have a listen to the other ones later on. Okay, so this is a popular record from 1967. We're talking kind of platinum disc, chart topping, at least in the US, but popular worldwide. And the modular features on it. Okay, so the Moog is providing those kind of whooshing, unstable parts, and it's partly for technical reasons. Um, the early oscillators were really difficult to get to stay in tune. You would spend some time warming them up and tuning them. They have to get physically warm to stay in tune at all. But then, like if sunlight falls on the synth and warms it slightly, or you open a window or a door, it could throw the whole thing out of tune. So to get around that temperature instability, humidity instability as well, um, it was used primarily by the early users for kind of almost sci-fi like effects, not too dissimilar to a theremin. And there was really no defined playing technique at this point. So yeah, you get all these kind of filtered whooshes in the background of things, of which the monkey's use is fairly typical. Um, yeah, it was kind of bought as a curiosity, and then they decided they should use it, or it was fun to use it. It's the kind of thing you get in a lot of the 60s pop that could afford it, whether it be the Rolling Stones or some of the other bigger artists. The Byrds, who were significant, particularly in the US, even have a song called the Moog Raga from 1968. So lots of the bigger bands were keen to try it out, but no one really knew what to do with it. So they were doing kind of subtractive techniques, but without really knowing what it could do. It's more like playing at this point. We get the Moog being really popularized by one record in particular. So it's really hard to find a recording of now, weirdly, but Switched on Bark by Wendy Carlos in 1968 was a #1 record in the US and did very well worldwide. And it's a series of covers of Bach's classical music done on a Moog modular by Wendy Carlos, who later did the soundtrack for A Clockwork Orange. And this was instrumental music, rearranging these classical pieces. And so it's a really unusual hit record, but it's sold by the bucket load. And for the public and for a lot of musicians, synthesizer wasn't really a word. The Wendy Carlos records were so successful that for most people, Moog meant synthesizer. So you might say, "Oh, I play the Moog," in the way that you would use the way that you would say, "I play the synthesizer" these days. In the 60s, if you knew what a synthesizer was, you probably knew it just as a Moog, and that was it. Like there were no other synthesizers out there. And that's quite a key thing. Moog was synonymous in the public perception with synthesizer, to the extent that the general public probably weren't aware of anything else being developed or being available. So it's one of the reasons Moog is such an iconic brand today. We get, by the later 60s, so this is 3 years after its invention, Perry and Kingsley are starting to figure out how you put the Moog modular and it's primarily subtractive synthesis to good use. So this is just a really great track, and so I like to use it as an example. These are a couple of commercial musicians, which I think is quite key. They are highly skilled in keyboard performance to start with, and they then apply that to subtractive synthesis, and you get this track, which is still quite contemporary sounding. Okay, so it's something that you might hear in bands like Broadcast. Um, it's influential on lots of artists, even kind of Kid A period Radiohead or something like that, in that it's melodic electronic music. They figured out how to play the Moog in tune for a start, which sounds silly, but was the bane of lots of early users. You can see there's a sense that from compared to the Monkeys example, they've actually started to figure out how to make it the main instrument and use it in a musical context other than it just being in the background. A year later than that, when I mentioned earlier that it's unfair to say that the Moog couldn't do experimental music, the best example of that I can think of is Douglas Leedy's Entropical Paradise. And it sounds like it could have been made on a bootler, in that it's not keyboard based, it's heavily sequenced, it's quite experimental, and it's more about tone and texture than about melody. So we often think of the bootler as more of a sound design tool, but the Moog could do that as well if you had mastered it. So it might have been easier to do on a bootler and to shape sounds in interesting ways, but the Moog wasn't incapable by any means. And yeah, this is quite a good example of that. Oh, sorry, just got to get the link to copy. There we go. So first thing to note is this is a much longer piece, of which I'll only play you a small amount, but it's 2 hours long, and it's a generative system. It's run by sequencers. There's no human playing. He sets up a patch and then lets it run in a kind of automated way. It's primarily not melodic, although it does have some melodic aspects, but it's quite a different approach. And its original title was Entropical Paradise, 6 sonic environments created on the Moog synthesizer for this piece. So we get something like this. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea that it's completely different in approach and sound to the more popular music uses of the Moog modular that most people associate with that instrument. You can get the instrument to do a wider range of things than perhaps most people assume. Okay, so Moving on to the Buchla and the West Coast style of synthesis. So first thing, there's no keyboard. We've got there we go. We've got a series of touch plates. So it looks a bit like a keyboard, but these are not tuned to semitone. This is not a chromatic keyboard. These knobs can be tuned to any voltage. It's a continuous pot, and when you press the plate, it's not a key. It doesn't depress. It's like an on and off switch that's touch sensitive, and it will output both of these voltages simultaneously. And so you can tune these to microtones, non-Western scales. But crucially, the assumption is that they might do things that aren't pitch related. So you're not necessarily playing melodies with this, although if you tweak the knobs carefully, you could make it play melodies if you wanted to. But that's not assumed. So that's quite a big difference. The Moog, the East Coast model, assumes you're going to be playing melodic music, and you can maybe get it to do some other things that are more experimental, that aren't so melody focused. The Buchla, the West Coast style of synthesis, assumes very little in that regard. And this is a more versatile, more open-ended way of controlling things. You might be controlling, I don't know, the decay time of an envelope with this knob. So you press a key and it changes the decay time. And I don't know, the range of some randomness on the other knob. You're not necessarily directly playing melodic music with this thing, although you could make it do that. So that's the first key difference between East and West Coast synthesis ideas. So the second, and it's related, is that the Buchla instrument and West Coast synthesis generally includes sequencing, but it tends to be not assuming you're going to have multiples of 4. So you typically don't have 8 or 16 steps with your Buchla sequencer, or your Surge sequencer for that matter. Famously, the Buchla music easel has 5 steps, and the idea is to kind of gently encourage you to think beyond 4/4. So although you can set it to have 4 steps and just not use the 5th, it wants to push you to think beyond that. So in the design choices that are made, it's trying to gently encourage you to try out new things in a way that the Moog East Coast philosophy didn't. So essentially, the design of the Buchla, these West Coast ideas, are encouraging you to experiment. Alongside that, you have what Buchla called the source of uncertainty, which was really a randomness generator. And he tried to make a musical random generator. It's actually not random in that the distribution tries to be musically pleasing, but it's essentially a chance generator. You trigger it, and it's probabilistic. It produces a note from a range of possibilities and keep triggering it, and you get this chance output. So you never quite know what note it's going to produce, but it tries to produce something musically pleasing. So it's not just like using a white noise signal at a sample and hold kind of randomness. It's kind of tuned randomness, if you like, shaped randomness. So this combination of things, touch plates, sequencers with odd numbers of steps, and the source of uncertainty are really the Buchla alternative control systems to the keyboard. So instead of a traditional keyboard, you get this combination of things. You could actually persuade Moog to produce you something similar. In the slides I've put on the previous page, there's a link to a Moog modular commissioned by Joel Chadabe in 1969 that has no keyboard at all, and it's much more like this kind of instrument. But yeah, the off-the-shelf Moog had a keyboard, the off-the-shelf Buchla modular had this combination of 3 things. And you get the idea, it's kind of more experimental, less popular music focused. Okay, so the next thing is in terms of sound. So the Buchla, like the Moog, didn't really stay in tune. You get the commonality there, and it's because a temperature compensation was really beyond the electronics of the day. It's a comparatively tricky thing to do electronically, and so the Buchla didn't really try, and it's related to not having that keyboard, but also to the kinds of synthesis that it's offering. So the Buchla West Coast idea is that you have the complex oscillator, which is really just a dual oscillator that produces usually simple waveforms like sine and triangle. It may well have a square wave as well, but not always. And then you use one oscillator within the complex oscillator block to modulate the other, usually via frequency modulation. And when we do frequency modulation in a digital domain, it stays perfectly in tune. We can set one oscillator to be a ratio of another, and we can have it produce perfectly harmonic sounds. The Buchla was so difficult to keep in tune, they didn't even try to make tuneful FM sounds. So it was really suited for making kind of clanking, metallic, bell-like, those kinds of inharmonic sounds via frequency modulation. And it was about sounds that would evolve over time. So where the East Coast philosophy, the Moog, uses a filter, opening and closing, changing the resonance amount and so on, to evolve its sounds over time. The West Coast philosophy is to take this frequency modulated pair of sine waves or triangle waves and to apply wave shaping or wave folding to do that. We'll come to what wave folding and wave shaping are. But essentially, where a filter subtracts harmonic content, wave shaping and wave folding adds harmonic content to a simpler waveform as a starting point. Basically, feed a sine wave in, wave shape it, and you get something with lots of harmonics coming out. I'll show you on my modular system a bit, the kinds of effects you might get, and I'll show you how to do it in Pure Data and VCV Rack. But more than anything else, this idea of wave folding or wave shaping defines the sound of West Coast synthesis. Second to that, you have the idea of the low pass gate, which is a specific kind of filter, the amplitude profile of a sound. Basically, it was commonly used to make bongo sounds, which is an oversimplification, but that's what it was great at, making kind of natural sounding percussion. And that's what we'll do with it as well. We've then, last but not least, and these are of secondary importance really, they're not so important. We've got the use of delay, particularly in the surge instruments, but it's delay as a sound shaping tool. Rather than delay as echo, it's delay as something that shapes the tone of a sound being put through it. So kind of like a distortion effect, used in a much more creative way than a guitar type echo. The Moog had a delay unit eventually, but it was intended for more neutral echo effects. The Buchla and Surge delays were more wild, I'm going to say. You could get them to feed back and they were really noisy, and you could use them to really mess up the sounds you put in it in creative ways. Last but not least, because the Buchla didn't have a keyboard, it didn't make sense to have ADSR envelopes. Those ADSR envelopes that track the key press. So instead of 4-stage envelopes, Buchla had simpler 2-stage, a stage, a decay stage, and that was it. But it would have lots of them. They would often come in pairs or a quad format, so you get 4. And you could connect one to another to make a more complex envelope shape if you wanted. You can actually make an ADSR envelope out of it, but the default was that it wasn't related to keyboard presses in the same way that East Coast techniques were. Okay, so just so you can hear what a Buchla modular might sound like. Okay, so gives you just a little flavour of the sorts of things the Buchla did most easily. So if you think that this instrument, like the Moog modular, is from 1964, you can see how influential it was, particularly in terms of its sequencer. Um, so its way of automating the playing of notes was really influential, and it's the basis for so many kinds of music since. But it was also adept at that drone type stuff where it's more about timeboards, but most people didn't use this one with a keyboard, but they would have used the Moog with a keyboard because it came with one. So if you were persistent, you could jam a keyboard into this and it would, sort of play in tune, but not quite. But most people used it more in this keyboardless form. At the same time as that, you can hear some wave shaping going on. So we get, just go back a little bit, we get an accent being created. So we've got some frequency modulation going on. And then for the accents of the sound that kind of hit out a little bit harder than the other parts of the rhythm, we've got wave shaping being cranked up. Again, using the sequencer to control that. So on that sixth step there, we get the wave shaping, giving us that kind of more aggressive part of the rhythm. Yeah, this is the 100 series. And this was made in far smaller numbers than the Moog modular. So this was perhaps numbering in the tens. And it was mostly composers, experimental composers, plus a few institutions that brought these. I don't think any popular musicians, at least that I know of, got their hands on this. But have you heard of the red panel in relation to the Buchla? So this was made, as I mentioned before, around San Francisco. Mid-60s in San Francisco is the start of hippie culture. And in the middle of the first Buchla 100 was a red panel. And the red panel was coated in LSD. And the idea was that you would lick it to get some musical inspiration when you needed it. And so there was a gap here with LSD painted on. And they found that instrument recently in a garage, and it was sent for repair. And they found some traces of some 50-year-old LSD, kind of deactivated by time, but still some traces of it left over. And it's become quite notorious in the Buchla story. Buchla was a strange guy who was kind of part hippie, whilst also designing some things for NASA on a freelance basis. So he was, part San Francisco hippie, part NASA engineer. So he knew his stuff, but was kind of immersed in this hippie culture that was unique at that point to San Francisco. And so it made it even into the first version of his instrument. He was familiar with, some quite out there psychedelic ideas. So what looks like quite a serious thing, and and he's brilliantly well engineered, and very, very carefully designed, was meant to perhaps encourage freer, wilder improvisation than the East Coast Moog instrument. And it's one of the stories that's used to kind of emphasize this idea of East and West Coast synthesis. West Coast are kind of more out there, freer, more wildly experimental. The Moog is kind of more sensible, more conservative, at least in the popular opinion. Okay, just to go back to the slide for a second. The Buchla that's made its way into the world perhaps most often is the music easel, and this combines all the ideas of Buchla in a more compact package. So the idea is that it's not a massive modular that you can't really move around. This is a bit like the Mini Moog compared to the Moog modular. The Buchla music easel is a performance-friendly, you can carry it in a suitcase, distilled miniature version of the Buchla 100 series. Crucially, this didn't come out until 1974, and so by that time, the Mini Moog was a runaway success. The Mini Moog was so successful, it outsold the Moog modular by 10 or 20 times. And so when MIDI was developed, the Mini Moog with its keyboard was the assumed model for MIDI. The Buchla music easel is a really interesting small instrument, but it never really caught on. It was kind of a niche thing, and so it wasn't so influential. But it's a portable, complex oscillator, wave shaping instrument with touch plates. And again, I'll just show you a short video to give you an idea of what it can do. It can do most of what the bigger modular can do, but it's patchable in a different way. It's you can program it, but you program it using a combination of patch cables this time and cards, which are essentially an early form of preset. You change the card to change presets for different parts of the instrument. So it's quite groundbreaking. It's all entirely analog, but you program it in an unusual way for an analog instrument. It's not just all about patching, which you can still do. Okay, so by 1974, we've got this little instrument that kind of embodies these West Coast ideas. And as I mentioned before, there's lots of stuff available on Bob Moog and his ideas, but there's relatively little available on Buchla. And what's available is quite sad. He's quite old by the time anyone convinced him to do an interview. And there's only two I know of where he talks about his own ideas. And in one of them, he's recently had a stroke, and so he's not saying all that much. And so most of the things about Buchla are through secondhand sources, people who play the instruments and write about it rather than the designer himself. A much more introspective guy. Moog would go and sort of sell the instrument at all the trade fairs. So his East Coast ideas got spread as much by his outgoing personality, whereas Buchla wouldn't do that kind of thing. I think he hated publicity and wasn't very personable. And so he was reliant upon kind of word of mouth. He didn't really do as much marketing. He produced small numbers of instruments throughout his whole career, really. So different approaches to synthesis, East Coast and West Coast, are complemented by different personalities of their designers. Okay, and so we looked at some Moog tracks, and there's some more for you to maybe have a listen to later. With the Buchla instrument, with its West Coast synthesis ideas, we've got it the opposite way around. The assumed position is that people are going to make some really out there stuff with it. It's going to be experimental composition all the way. And that's true to a certain extent. Morton Subotnick's famous Silver Apples of the Moon is, fairly typical late 60s experimental electronic music. It's well worth listening to. If you listen to any one Buchla track that kind of embodies its ethos, it's this one. But people also started using it for melodic music later on. Probably the master of West Coast synthesis is Susan Ciani, who is a composer still around today, still playing, and she had a commercial music career as well, using it for a series of adverts for things like Coca-Cola, IBM during the 80s. And then perhaps most famously of contemporary artists, Nine Inch Nails use Buchla instruments quite heavily, particularly in their live shows. But they make, we'll see, heavy kind of industrial, quite popular music. It's not just all experimental composition for this. So I'll show you just a little bit of Morton Subotnick, but check out the Nine Inch Nails if you want to hear it used in a more contemporary popular context too. And then we will make some stuff. We'll have perhaps a 5-minute break, and then we'll come to make some of this stuff. Okay, so just a short excerpt of Morton Subotnick here. Okay, so you can hear some of the classic Buchla features, wave-shaped sounds from sine waves, essentially continuously varying distortion being applied to sine waves. You've got little pinging sounds from the low-pass gate, which we'll come to later on, and you've got randomness being used to generate pitches rather than keyboard control. So if any recording encapsulates what people think of 60s West Coast synthesis, it's this one, this Silver Apples of the Moon. But take a listen to some Nine Inch Nails or some Susan Ciani if you want to hear the different things it can do. We won't look at all of them now for time reasons. But okay, we'll have a 10-minute break now. And if you're having any problems with uploading files, we'll use the break to solve those problems. And so if we come back for 20 to 11, 10:40, we will make some things in Pure Data and VCV Rack. And then we'll show you some similar things on the modular synth at the same time, while I work with 2 cameras at once, which should be interesting. If you need any help, give me a shout now. If not, come back at 10:40. We'll get cracking on some production. Okay, and just in case you missed it at the start, if you haven't yet filled out the mid-module evaluation form, it'd be great if you could do that as well. So I'll just put the link back into the chat. And if you could spend a couple of minutes on that, that'd be fantastic. But yeah, If I don't hear from you about your assignment, I assume you're okay with uploading it. So just send me a message if you need me to help you with anything. Okay, I'm just going to grab a coffee and I will be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, so I'm back and freshly caffeinated. Yeah, if you've got anything you want to ask or clarify while we're in the break, feel free. Um, just give me a shout. I'll keep an eye on the chat while I just set up for the next bit. Okay, right. So it's 22:11. Happy to get going? Hmm. Okay, so this next bit, I'll look at how you apply some of those ideas from Buchla and also some from Serge, these West Coast ideas in pure data and VCV rack. What I don't want you to have to do is feel that you should make everything as we go along, because it would take you ages, and rushing while you're trying to kind of watch and listen may not be the best way to do it. And so what I've done is put together some resources that cover every single patch that we'll have a look at in a bit more detail. And I've done that for PD and I've done that for VCV rack in separate documents. So as well as the slides from today, I'll put these two resources. So the pure data one is first, and there's a VCV one as well. And the VCV ones have videos. And the patches for everything are available in files on Canvas as well. So pure data, sort of additional information in the first link, VCV additional information in the second, and then in files for week 8, you have access to all of the things that we're going to have a look at. And again, they're divided by pure data and VCV. Can you just check that you can access the files link, this last link that I've just put in? Just check you can get into it, as I want to make sure there's not like a permissions issue or anything. If you just click it and you can see the files, all should be well. But if it says like, no, you're not allowed in, yeah, let me know and we'll tweak the settings. Okay, you're able to get into the files, okay? If you just say, yay, probably only need one person to test it. Okay, great. But it looks like you can get in, does it? It's enabling you to access them. It might, yeah, there's a few of them, so it might take a minute. Great. I'll leave them there after the session, of course, as well. So you can come back to them. Okay, so West Coast synthesis ideas are quite flexible and they tend to appear in all sorts of sound design scenarios. So film sound is a typical application of these, but also video game sound. The last 5 or 10 years have seen a lot of video game sound designers exploring synthesis in more depth. And if you've played any of the recent Doom titles, although the latest one will be the last one, its sound designer has become quite well known, and he uses a lot of these West Coast synthesis ideas in the recent Doom soundtracks. He actually uses a small modular synth in addition to software sound design tools to create those soundtracks. But because West Coast techniques of wave shaping, low pass gates, and so on produce quite a wide range of textures, interesting abstract textures. Yeah, seeing a lot of use in games and film sound, perhaps more than ever. Okay, and so because we're a module about synthesis, I'm not going to look at touch plates and the idea of going beyond the keyboard in any more detail. I'm going to focus on a little bit of sequencing to start with, and really just explaining how it's sort of reimagining what you might already know about sequencing. And I'm going to focus particularly on wave shaping and then the idea of the low pass gate and combining those two things. So, first of all, okay, there's the idea of a 5-step sequencer rather than 4-step. And this is fairly typical of the kind of thing that you might see. You can see that there are rows and columns, and the columns are the important bit. So we get step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, and then 5. And we can use just 4 steps if we want, or 3, or 2, or just 1 step. And when we're on that step, we'll get these 4 voltages being output simultaneously. And yeah, the idea is that the extra step just gives you lots more flexibility to go beyond 4/4 patterns. So I'm going to start with pure data. And I think I'll look at some pure data examples first and then come back to VC rack, rather than trying to switch constantly between pure data and VCV, as that's quite clunky. So pure data first, and I'll show you a couple of different ways of doing things. But really, on the sequencing side, it's just thinking slightly differently rather than having lots of new patches. So okay, I'm just going to share my screen now. So just let me know if you can see it in a moment. Okay, just to check, you can see my screen now. Just let me know that you can, and don't worry about feedback. I'll sort that out in a sec. But just that you can see PD in this window. Yeah, great. Okay, so for a moment, I can't see your chat. So if you ask anything, I will come back to it in a moment, just for kind of practical reasons. Okay, so what we've got here is something you're probably reasonably familiar with. We've got a metronome ticking along a counter. So the counter counts up from 0. And then we use the modulo object here simply to break our count down into multiples of 5 in this case. So by doing that, we set a step length for our sequence. So I've shifted from having 4 steps or 8 steps or 16 to having 5. So you won't notice anything radically different at this stage, other than the number of steps. And I'm using this array here to be able to set my steps, to set the pitches I'm going to play in this case by drawing into the array, and then okay, so nothing you haven't heard or seen before really there, except the step number. So the first thing I want to suggest in terms of West Coast style sequencing is that you use where it might normally be a fixed number of steps like 4 or 8 or 16, you use this as a variable. So I'm just going to vary the number of steps we have in the sequence, and we've got 5 steps here, and we can vary this in real time. So I'll start with 5. We can't go higher than the number of steps we have in the array, but we can set this anywhere from between 1 and 5. So 5 steps first of all, but then okay, so just stop sharing for a moment. So it's a simple idea. Vary the number of steps as you go along, and you turn a short sequence that endlessly repeats into something more varied and interesting. And you can use, for instance, the keyboard input to play with the sequence length. So rather than use keys to play pitches, you might pre-program a sequence into your sequencer and then use the keyboard to switch between the number of steps as it plays. So it's a really simple idea, but it gives you the ability to create much more dynamically varied sequences. It's something that can turn your patterns from being kind of dull and repetitive into something more exciting. And if we do that at the extreme, we get something like Ortekra's Flutter. You might have heard this piece or heard of it. It was controversial at the time it was made because it was made to circumvent the laws the Conservative government brought in the 90s to ban raves. And Ortekra made a piece that supposedly didn't fall under the rave, anti-rave legislation of the time, which was based around the idea of music characterized by repetitive beats. So the idea was dance music with its drum machines had repetitive beats. And so Ortekra made a dance music track that its beats never repeated. And they did that by constantly varying the number of steps in the sequence. So they would program in on their drum machine a fairly conventional rhythmic pattern. And then, like I was doing then, just vary the sequence on the fly. And you get something like this. Okay, so it's quite a good example if you constantly vary the number of steps in your sequence so that it constantly restarts at different points of the kind of variation you can get. It's quite a classic track. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now. And then we'll look at a slightly more interesting example. This time, we're going to combine sequencing, pitch with a second sequencer. It's this idea of sequencing your sequencer. So we will use a second sequencer on top of the first to sequence the number of steps and then kind of dynamically play both of those things. So we can change the notes that are being played, and then we can also change the number of steps in the sequence, and we can do that in quite a live, real-time way. Okay, so just going to load up this next example. Okay, so what we've got here is the same patch as before, melody stored in an array. It doesn't matter what kind of sequencer you're using, really, the same ideas apply no matter how you make it. I like this one because you can draw the sequence in really easy. Above that, we've got a second array called sequence, and this one is going to set the length of the pattern. They're both read by the same counter, so they stay in time with each other. But essentially, what we draw up here will affect the pattern length. What we draw here will affect which notes we get in a sequence. Okay, so with the pattern length of 0, we just get one note. Then as we vary the pattern length, we can kind of create a whole host of different patterns on the fly as we go. Okay, so two relatively simple ideas that are really widely used in West Coast synthesis. I've got some examples in there. The next idea is to combine it with randomness. So we might now have a single array storing a sequence, and while a sequencer steps through that stored sequence in turn, a random process produces another melody line in parallel, randomly picking from that same collection of notes. So that gives us two related sequences. They're using the same pool of notes, the same collection of notes, but by having one that's playing a predictable sequence, the other that's picking from the same set of notes at random, we get a melody, a dual melody that never repeats itself. So I'm just going to show you how that might look and how that might sound. Okay, so what we've got here is just one array. This is where our melody is. This side is a conventional sequencer that repeatedly counts through the melody, plays note after note after note, and then cycles back. Whereas this side, this right-hand side, is picking from the same array, but moving at random between the steps. So I've got the control of the sequence length and control of the random range connected to one number box. And so now we essentially get two complementary melodies. One is played by one sawtooth oscillator, the other is played by another, shifted down an octave. Okay, so these patches are available in the file store from today, and they're the first set. So number one within the PD patches covers these kinds of sequencing things. And the important thing with pure data, or VCV rack for that matter, is you can take what you've done so far, which might be build a synth with just some basic sequencing on it, and for the second assignment, you could add to it. And one of the ways you could add to it is via extending its sequencing possibilities. So what you might want to do after the session, and of course we're going to have other sessions afterwards, and we'll be kind of tutorial based, working on your individual projects. You might want to combine some of these sequencing ideas with the synthesizer that you've produced for assignment one. So we talked briefly about that you might develop what you've done for the first assignment, what you've made for the first assignment. And one way you might do that is via extending its sequencing. You can also think about sequencing parameters beyond pitch. So I know I've been using these things to sequence the pitch of an oscillator. You could think about sequencing things like the cutoff frequency of a filter, the FM amount. There's all sorts of parameters within your patches, whether it be in PD or VCV rack, that you can sequence. But yeah, maybe experiment with time signatures that aren't based on fours, and think that all parameters are available to you for sequencing. Depending on what kind of synthesis technique you're using, if you're doing FM synthesis, it can be quite nice to sequence the FM index, so you get a more or less modulated sound as the sequencer counts through. You can use it to accent particular notes within a sequence, and that kind of thing. So the first part of West Coast style synthesis is really thinking differently about what you might have done before. Not just about sequencing pitch, not just about conventional time signatures. And really playing with pattern length and seeing all of the variations in a sequence that can give you. Okay, so the next part of West Coast synthesis, and the one we'll spend a little bit more time on, is the idea of the complex oscillator. So this combines two simple oscillators, producing, as a minimum, producing a sine wave each, but usually producing sine and triangle, maybe square as well, but we use the square for maybe as a sub-octave or something. But yeah, two simple oscillators in one block, and we then frequency modulate perhaps those sine waves, but crucially we do some wave folding to at least one of the two sine waves that we're producing. So looks like this, a typical complex oscillator. Have you seen anything looking like this previously? Okay, is this a completely new design to you? Or have you seen anything kind of similar? So it's a dual oscillator, and you can see it's nearly symmetrical down the middle. Got oscillator 1 here, oscillator 2 over the back. Okay, I'm going to assume it's completely new to you. What we've got is a slightly different layout to the classic Moog. Great. To the classic Moog oscillator. What we've got a coarse pitch control, a master pitch control here, this big knob here, and the idea is that the bigger the thing that you're turning, the easier it is to do kind of fine adjustments. So this is the pitch control for frequency control for oscillator 1, and then the pitch control for oscillator 2 here. And so these are the things that you as a player would tweak most often. And it's meant to be that they're the kind of clearest visually. The size of the thing is meant to kind of indicate that you should try twisting that and see what happens. Then we've got, compared to the Moog, which typically has the waveform outputs on the bottom, we've got these waveform outputs on the top up here. We've got here triangle only for the first oscillator, but we can actually switch it here between triangle, square, and sawtooth. But the assumption is that this one is going to be a triangle wave, which I'm trying to draw most of the time. This side, if you like, then modulates the second side, the right-hand side of the complex oscillator. So it's nearly symmetrical, but we've got a couple of different features over here. This time, we don't get to choose which waveforms we want. We only get a sine wave output. and a square output. And the idea is that this one modulates that one. So in the middle, we get a modulation index to choose the amount of frequency modulation that's being applied. So you can make something like this on a different kind of synthesizer, but here in the Buchla design, the classic West Coast design, it's a couple of oscillators and some frequency modulation kind of built together. Okay, so two simple oscillators. This one modulates that one. And then we get a wave folder. So it's actually the second oscillator only in the classic design that's wave folded. So this one modulates that one. We hear this output here. And before we hear it, before the final output, we have some wave shaping going on. And it's that wave shaping that's really key to the Buchla sound and to West Coast synthesis generally. Wave shaping is like the opposite of a filter. So where a filter subtracts harmonics, wave shaping typically adds harmonics. And the crucial thing is that we do it dynamically. So wave shaping and wave folding are two terms that are usually used interchangeably. But essentially, wave folding is a more specific case, and wave shaping is a term used to mean any kind of distortion that's applied to a waveform of any kind. So they're often kind of used interchangeably or misused. We'll call it wave shaping, but wave folding is a kind of wave shaping within that, as well as all the other kinds of distortion, overdrive, clipping you might imagine. Okay, and the key to interesting sounds via this technique is modulation. So a static wave shaping, a static distortion usually isn't very interesting. Things become more sonically interesting when we apply an LFO or similar to modulate the amount, modulate the depth while the sound is happening. It will give us these evolving textures. So this is a classic Buchla complex oscillator with wave folding going on. So we'll just have a listen to some of the sounds it can produce, and then we'll have a look at how to do it. Okay, so weirdly, it will not share my video. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so earlier in the video, so around this point, we've got a clean sine wave. So you'll hear the simple spectra. There's just the fundamental of the sound or close to it. There we go. And this right side is being modulated by the left. So we hear this one. We can hear a little bit of the modulation in there. But this oscillator is acting on this one. But then when we go a little bit further in, we start to hear the wave shaping being applied. Okay, so when the sound becomes brighter, more aggressive, uh, specifically when this knob or that knob are turned, um, we have some wave shaping being applied to simple modulated sine. And the idea is that by controlling these processes, the frequency of this oscillator on the left, the modulation oscillator, the frequency of this oscillator on the right, and the amount of wave shaping, we can create a wide range of sounds. It's a relatively simple idea, but it's the exact opposite of Moog's subtractive synthesis idea. So here we create complex sounds through the last stage, the wave shaping stage. It's the opposite of Moog's approach, which was to start with complex noisy sounds and then filter away at them. So yeah, it's another of the reasons why we think of these synthesizers in terms of East Coast and West Coast, because they're kind of opposites in the way synthesis is typically done. The booklet, of course, includes filters for some time, and you can do this kind of stuff on a Moog synth if you really wanted to. But it's that the Moog makes the subtractive synthesis easier. This booklet design makes this kind of wave-shaped complex sound generation easier. Is why they got their reputations as being opposites. Okay, so the idea of wave shaping and specifically wave folding on this design is that, yeah, you can see the sine wave here that goes in, and then out we get this more harmonically rich signal. And with wave folding and wave shaping generally, its key characteristic is that it doesn't change the pitch of the sound, only the spectra. So when we do FM, if you remember back to Matt's session on it, it's like applying vibrato to a sound. When we apply vibrato, the pitch varies up and down, wobbles up and down as the modulation is applied, like sliding our finger up and down the fretboard of a violin. Here, we get quite a similar effect, but without changing pitch at all. We're adding these extra harmonic folds, which create extra audible harmonics within the frequency at which our oscillator is running, which is the key difference between FM and wave shaping. It doesn't mess with pitch, even if you do it really slowly. So whereas with a slowly FM modulated sound, we'd get a kind of warbling of pitch up and down. That kind of dub siren type sound would be fairly typical. Here, when we do some wave folding, we can produce similar sounds, but without changing pitch at all. We just get the extra harmonics, and we can vary that very slowly or quickly, and get some timbres that are a bit like FM, other than for the pitch change. So wave folding, yeah, is where we multiply the incoming signal within one period of the waveform, i.e. pitch doesn't change, we just get extra harmonics being added. And then wave folding is a kind of wave shaping, but wave shaping includes, yeah, all the other sorts of distortion you can imagine. It's anything that modifies the shape of an incoming waveform. So if you plug your guitar into a tube amp, you're effectively wave shaping by putting it through a tube circuit to get some extra harmonic content on there. The whole reason you might use a tube amp is to add harmonics, and that's the kind of wave shaping. And it's dynamic because if you're a guitarist, you'll know that if you pluck the string quietly, your tube amp responds differently to if you really pick in and hammer the strings. And so there we're kind of varying the level of the guitar signal as it goes into the tube amp. In synthesis, we might artificially vary the level of the signal going into the wave folding or wave shaping. And the level of the signal, by varying it, will have a dramatic effect on the signal that comes out the other end. The amount of wave shaping, the amount of wave folding will vary massively depending on the level of the signal that goes in. So we can use that creatively to increase the range of sounds we can make. Okay, so the simplest kind of wave shaping we can do is clipping. So this is exactly the same kind of clipping that you probably fear in your studio modules. So who has recorded something that was ruined by some digital clipping that was unintended? Have you recorded vocals or guitar, thought, oh, that's a great take, only to find that it's clipped and it wasn't usable? Okay, so in a studio context, clipping is often undesirable, at least kind of harsh digital clipping. But we can use it in more creative ways than that. We can use it as a wave shaping tool. But we need to differentiate between hard and soft clipping. So you might have seen this kind of diagram before. At the top, we have hard clipping, where we get to a threshold, and when our signal goes past that, we clip the tops of the waveform off, and they're just harshly cut off. And anything above that is just completely cut off. And the same at the bottom as well, of course. Clipping can apply to the positive and the negative parts of the waveform. But in hard clipping, we get a near total shear cut off above that point, and it gives us a characteristic square wave. Okay, so in hard clipping, we'd get a very squared off waveform, top and bottom. And it will sound like a square wave. That's quite key. Looks like a square wave, sounds like a square wave. With soft clipping, we get a more gradual rounding. So with soft clipping, as we approach the threshold, you can see our waveform is gradually rounded off and forced to stop short of the clipping threshold. The closer we push to the threshold with soft clipping, the more distorted our waveform will be. But typically, soft clipping, of course, on the negative side of the waveform as well, soft clipping is less harsh sounding, more analog sounding is a term often used, and it can be desirable. Hard clipping is usually considered digital because it's either clipped or not. It's kind of square wave like, it's kind of binary. It's not usually considered desirable, but there are some uses of it. Okay, the next thing we get is the difference between asymmetric and symmetrical clipping. So what we've got is the 0 point for our waveform, and in symmetrical clipping, the clipping is the same top and bottom, like in this example. In asymmetric clipping, what we get is clipping that's applied differently. So the bottom of the waveform might clip here. So our waveform looks something like this. Whereas the top of the waveform may be full range or clipped at a different point. So what we get is essentially a wonky waveform, the top of which is clipped differently to the bottom, and that's asymmetric clipping. Have you seen these kinds of clipping before? Have you experienced them for yourself? Intentionally or otherwise? Yeah, absolutely. In most cases, it's accidental. In most cases, clipping is to be avoided. But what we can do in a synthesis context is vary the amount of clipping dynamically. And so we can actually use it in a more creative way. We can use it to turn a sine wave into a square. And instead of just switching between the two or mixing between the two like we might do on a Moog, we can wave shape between square and sine using a clipping object, and we get all the points in between. So we can get a smooth transition between sine and heavily distorted sine, which sounds square-like. So I'm just going to show you that effect in pure data. Okay, so this is a simple hard clipping in PD with, I'm just going to move it down slightly on the screen. One second. Okay, with 100 hertz sine wave, on the left-hand side, the sine just passes through to the DAC. In the middle, we've got symmetrical hard clipping, and on the right-hand side, we've got asymmetric clipping. And we should hear harmonic differences when we turn on the audio. Activate the sine. Just turn up the frequency a bit. But we get just a simple sine wave, whereas clip it and we get something that's harmonically rich. An asymmetric clipping will vary the harmonic content again, creating an imbalance between the odd and even harmonics. Okay, higher frequency still. Sine, symmetrical hard clipping, and asymmetrical hard clipping. Okay, and so the idea is that we, instead of switching between those sounds, we can, if we want to, as a kind of wave shaping process, smoothly move between the two of them by varying the bounds of the clipping. So we could do that manually. We could add sliders to the clipping object. So if we just go back in, we could, as long as we remember that the signal is always between -1 and 1, we don't go over those bounds, we can vary those numbers manually. So as I vary the bound, you can hear the harmonic content of the sound changing. It's quite a subtle effect. It's the kind of thing you can automate using an LFO. It's a quite interesting effect. Modulate it really quickly and you start to get some amplitude modulation becoming audible, and so you get wave shaping at the same time as amplitude change. Move more slowly and we can create these kind of richly evolving drone sounds. Okay, so that's the absolute simplest kind of wave shaping, based around clipping. It's in the second part of the patches within today's files. if you want to try it. Let's move briefly to VCV. So we can see a more fully developed form of wave shaping being applied to the sound. So thousands, millions, infinite numbers of different wave shaping algorithms can be applied to the sound, but with the same general principles, no matter what your wave shaping algorithm is, hard clipping being the simplest. Varying the bounds of the clipping creates some interesting effects. So I'm just going to load up VCV. Okay, so just going to share the screen to VCV Rack. Okay, so what we've got here is maybe the simplest imaginable wave shaping. I'm using one third-party object. It's linked in the document where I talk about some of the patches. So I'll just pop that in the chat for reference. But I'm using a third-party wave shaper. It's free. You just need to install it. And it's by Hetrick. And it's this second module in from the left-hand side. And I picked this one. There's not a wave shaper or a wave folder built into VCV that I know of by default. I picked this one because it's free. It's quite nicely designed, and it's got quite a classic sound. So it's quite a good choice if you're starting out, and it's capable of quite a wide range of sounds as well. What we've got is a sine wave being produced by our oscillator on the left-hand side here. Going into our wave shaper, you can see the sine out connected to the input of the wave shaper, the output of the wave shaper going into the mixer, and then we hear and can see the waveform. So let me turn up the level of the mixer. We should hear as well as see it. Okay. What we've got now is sine wave going in, and then as this LFO modulates the shaper, our sine gets shaped gradually into a square wave, and then back to a sine at the rate at which our modulation LFO here is running. So our LFO here is connected to the shaper amount. As we speed it up, you can see that transformation between sine and square happening more quickly. Okay. So this is like the inverse of opening and closing a filter. So whereas when a filter opens, the sound gets brighter. Whereas a filter closes, the harmonics are subtracted. Here, we're adding harmonics, and then it's going back to the sine wave when there's less of the wave shaping being applied. Okay, so hopefully that's quite straightforward. We move from the original waveform through to the other, but because we're not simply crossfading between two different waveforms, we're shaping the single input here, we have no problems with phase. We're not mixing signals, we're transforming a single signal. And that has some advantages. The wave shaper enables us to change the transfer function that's applied. So the transfer function is a mathematical description of the kind of transformation that's taking place. So we've had it fixed going from sine to square, but any kind of shape as our destination is possible. So we could actually make it transform between sine and triangle, sine and kind of a noisier waveform. Any sort of imaginable destination waveform is possible. So if I turn up the level again, and then this control at the top of the shaper, I can change what our waveform evolves into. So we're going between sine and kind of spike here. And it's got different harmonic content. You can hear that it's less harmonically rich than when we move between sine and this kind of aggressive square wave. Okay, and because we're wave shaping, we're not frequency modulating, our pitch stays constant. Unless we change the oscillator's pitch, we never get any audible change in pitch happening, no matter what we do with the wave shaping and how much we apply. Okay, and so that's the main advantage of wave shaping over things like frequency modulation. We never have any worry of our sounds drifting in pitch as the modulation is applied, particularly in the analog domain where pitch stability is a problem. So if we're using analog hardware, but also in software, it's a useful thing to be able to do, and will sound different and behave differently to the kinds of synthesis you've done before. Okay, so perhaps more than any other technique, wave shaping defines West Coast style synthesis. It's become synonymous with it. But there are all sorts of wave shapers out there. You can get as many different wave shapers as you can imagine. And in software, you can create an infinite number of different wave shaping algorithms. You could model it on particular kinds of distortion that you may want. You can create entirely new kinds of transfer function, new kinds of wave shaping description in software you couldn't do any other way. They can be subtle, they can be aggressive, they can leave the original sound unrecognizable. So typically, you might get different stages of wave folding in a classic West Coast synth. By combining multiple stages together, you get more aggressive shaping being applied. It's the typical idea. So when we're folding the sound, we might have an initial stage where we fold the sound a little, adding a little to the harmonic content of the sound. We fold it again in a second stage. It becomes increasingly folded, more harmonic content being added, and then a third stage where it's folded even more times. And by this point, we've got a really aggressive kind of sound coming out the other end. And although we use sine waves as the example, and they're the classic source that you wave fold or wave shape, you can try this on things like drums. Feed drums in, and you'll get an effect that's a little bit like bit crushing, a little bit like frequency modulation, but something really distinct. It's quite a popular thing. You don't have to stick to the classic sound sources. You can experiment. And people have been experimenting with this technique, and it's possible to imagine, for instance, wave shaping being applied to Moog-style subtractive synthesis to create a kind of hybrid. I've got an example in VCV Rack where that's taking place. Just going to share my screen and just close this example. Okay, so again, I've got videos for to enable you to recreate these kinds of patches where I talk through them in more detail. Do have a look at those if it's something you might want to develop for your second assignment. Here we've got an extension of the first patch, and I've got keyboard control this time, and I've got a filter in there after the wave shaper, and so also a couple of ADSR envelopes controlled from the filter. And the idea was to make something that merged subtractive synthesis with some West Coast ideas. So I've got wave shaping of a sine wave, but after the sine wave is wave shaped, we go into a filter, and I've got a little bit of delay on there as well. And two envelopes vary the amount of resonance and the filter cutoff. And the idea was to create, using this sound source into the delay, something that I could play with a keyboard that had a bit of a kind of plucked metallic sound. So using the QWERTY keyboard, I can just demonstrate this. Let's turn it up a little bit. Okay, and the idea of this patch is that it's responsive to key presses. So as you hold down the key, the sound becomes more aggressively wave shaped. Let go of the key and the wave shaping relaxes and the sound gradually decays and becomes less harmonically rich. Try it for yourself. It's the no coast example in the VCV rack patches from today. I've also got in the VCV rack sheet from today a more detailed breakdown of it. But yeah, these things, there's no need to be reverential and just use West Coast techniques. Think about how to mix them with subtractive synthesis or additive synthesis, and you can get some more unusual results. Okay. The thing to point out is that software gives you just endless flexibility. I've put a couple of my wave shaping patches into today for you to try out. And it would be interesting to add these to some of the things that you've produced previously, perhaps. So in my example, I'm just folding a sine wave at this point. And then I'm modulating that with an LFO. And we can vary the number of stages to determine how aggressive the wave shaping is. But you could try adding this to, for instance, a drum machine, to a bass synthesizer, any kind of sound source, really. Think of these as modular additions to what you've done before, perhaps. You can really expand the range of sounds you can get. You'll see that modulation is key. Everything that can be modulated has an LFO modulating it, and it just helps to create richer sounds. You can try replacing LFOs with static values to see the difference that makes. But generally, modulate slowly for kind of evolving harmonic drones, modulate quickly for you can get dubstep style wobbles and quite aggressive tones that way. There's a couple of different designs. One sounds much more aggressive and bites into the sine wave a lot more than the other. And again, I've got a tutorial video from building a patch from scratch in VCV rack. Okay, so the other characteristic part of West Coast synthesis comes from the low pass gate, and the low pass gate is really an extension of what you can do with a standard filter, specifically pinging the filter, as it's known. So filter pinging is where you turn the resonance of a filter almost to the point it self oscillates. If you've tried our little hardware synth that we have in the performance hub at any point, it's an example of a Moog style filter in hardware that self oscillates really easily. Most filters will. If you turn the resonance all the way up, squealing will happen, or they'll produce a sine wave depending on the design of the filter. But if you get to that point, turn the resonance back just very slightly, and then you send a trigger or a gate or some other kind of impulse to stimulate the filter, it will ping and produce a decaying sine wave. So essentially, you strike the filter with a trigger or an impulse. While it's close to full oscillation, while it's close to self oscillation, and you'll get a short ringing percussive sound that decays over from a few milliseconds up to seconds, depending on how high the resonance is turned up. And so you can use a filter to make sound rather than just process sounds, if that makes sense. A filter pinged that way can be a sound source. Just switching to pure data. Okay, so this is one of the simpler PD patches you could imagine. Not everything is complicated, and not everything that sounds interesting is necessarily complicated. So what we've got is a state variable filter. It could be any of the filters in pure data, but this one sounds nicer than some of the others. So I'm just using the SVF from the Cyclone library. And I've got this click object to ping the filter with a one sample impulse. So just ping, 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 whenever I click the bang here. And then I use the random object to randomly vary the filter cutoff. And I get a decaying sine wave at the cutoff frequency of the filter. So I'm just going to make that a little bit louder. Okay, so when I ping the filter, this bang produces a click, stimulates the filter at the input. The random object varies the cutoff frequency, and then I've got the resonance really high, almost to full resonance. So full resonance, where it would self-oscillate, is a value of 1. And so by default, I've got this resonance set to 0.95, so nearly all the way to self-oscillation. And it's that lets me get these kind of ringing sounds at the output. And you can hear it's quite a gentle sound, a little bit like a, I don't know, a marimba or something. And I can vary the amount of ringing from the filter by varying the amount of resonance. So too little resonance and there's no ringing, I just get a little clicking. Turn the resonance all the way up, close to maximum, close to 1. And I get a sine wave that takes a couple of seconds, a few seconds to decay. This is one of the classic techniques, and it's on the way to producing or reproducing what's commonly known as the Buchla bongo. So the Buchla bongo is um, like one of the classic West Coast patches, um, created by pinging a low pass gate in this way. And a low pass gate is just a specialized kind of filter. I'm just going to go back to my slide for a second. So a low pass gate is specifically a low pass filter configured to behave like a VCA. So a filter configured to act on the amplitude of a signal as well as its spectral content. And Buchler's idea was that natural sounds, when they're louder, so imagine a percussive hit from an acoustic percussive sound. When it's quiet, we have a more muted spectrum, more muted spectra than if we really strike the percussive thing harder. So if we whack something really hard, we'll get a brighter sound as well as a louder one. And this was his idea for the low pass gate, to recreate that interconnectedness between the spectra, the frequency content of things, and their amplitude. So his idea was that as you stimulate the low pass gate a little bit, it's more muted. It allows sound through, but it's the spectra is kind of rolled off, like closing a low pass filter. And then as you really ping the low pass gates with a higher amplitude trigger or gate, you get a brighter sound being allowed through. And it gives this characteristic bongo effect. It sounds something like this. Okay, so gives you an idea of the sorts of sounds that are really typical. And this, alongside wave shaping, is kind of the other classic West Coast, the classic Buchler sound. That percussive, rubbery, boinging quality is the result of a specific electrical component called a Vactral, which, when activated with a pulse, takes a few hundred milliseconds perhaps to decay. It's like a weird anomaly that we wouldn't usually see as desirable in a circuit. But it's also used in things like the Drawmer compressor in Studio One. Musically, this weird response where they don't just open and close, it opens quickly and then takes a certain amount of time to decay back to zero. Has turned out to be musically useful. And then in software, we can then model those sorts of behaviors. You know, a lot of software is about modeling these kinds of non-linearities, as they're known. But yeah, originally it was probably unintentional, but it's become a really desirable effect. Vactrals are this kind of electrical components that's found in the low-pass gate. And just as a result of this niche market, these obsolete technologies from the 50s that wouldn't otherwise exist, as well as their use in compressors in a similar way, have pushed up their prices to make the hardware now really expensive. They're even to manufacture this stuff. And so there's been a lot of effort to digitally model them. A lot of software plugins that for uses like compression have to model these behaviors, but Buchla was the first person to exploit them musically. Yeah, and that characteristic bongo percussive ringing sound is just, yeah, a result of this quirk in a specific electrical component called a Vactral. Um, completely unintended at the time, I'm almost certain. Yeah, it's become quite well known. VCV Rack has some great low pass gate emulations. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of them. Okay, I'm just going to switch screens. Okay, so again, this has a full video tutorial available to you as it's a slightly more involved patch, but it's getting towards applying West Coast techniques to something more musical. So we've got the wave shaping patch from earlier, but immediately after the wave shaper, we now have a low pass gate. And we use the low pass gate to provide an amplitude envelope so our sound's not playing all of the time, and also to shape the spectral content. And to open the low pass gate, so sound passes to trigger the low pass gate, we use this sequencer, which is over the left hand side. And it's just the standard built-in sequencer within VCV Rack. And we use the gate output to open the trigger input of the LPG. And so this gate output pings the LPG and gives it its characteristic ringing, its characteristic percussive sound. And at the same time, we use these control voltage rows from the sequencer to change the pitch of our oscillator, to change the amount of resonance of the filter side of the LPG. And what we get when we put that together is this kind of accented sequence. So what we can do now is change the response of the LPG. So if I decrease the response, you can hear the sequence becomes a series of short clicks. This is emulating a Vactral with a very fast response. We don't get any of that rubbery decay we had on the bongo sound. The bongo patch increase the response, increases the time to decay. And we get a longer decay for each sound. If I slow the sequence down, you can hear that longer decay being imparted onto the sound. At the same time, with every trigger, with every gate opening the LPG, we modulate the wave shaping amount with this LFO down here. So we get the effect of the wave shaping still, but some of the high end is being rolled off by the LPG. It's most apparent with longer decay times. Okay. speed the sequence back up. Okay, and the last thing we're doing is using a second LFO to vary the number of steps we have in our sequence. So a little bit like I was doing manually in pure data, we can use an LFO to vary between having 8 steps active and just 1. And that creates some rhythmic variation. So we don't just get the same sequence coming out all the time. Okay, if I just let that play for a second, you'll hear some of that variation. Okay, and so anything that can be manipulated by hand can be automated using LFOs or similar to do the moving of the knob, if you like, for you. VCV Rack makes that quite simple. You simply patch an LFO into any parameter. You can offset it to change the range, but you can use it as the basis for making something musical, whether it be a composition or a song, for introducing all sorts of variations into it. I know it's something Matt will look at in later weeks, Richard as well, but turning these sorts of sketches, these initial ideas, into kind of fuller pieces of music, perhaps. Okay, so those are the main parts of West Coast synthesis. I just want to make sure that you are all set for your submissions this afternoon. Is there anything that you want to ask? We've got about an hour left potentially, so there's time to sort out anything that's cropped up. Are all your files in? Are you happy with it? Do you need to resubmit anything? Are you struggling with anything? Tane, I'm not sure you were here first thing. So yeah, if you're having any problems submitting work, whether it's because of file sizes or anything else, with the deadline for assignment 1 being 2 o'clock this afternoon, yeah, now is probably a good time to sort that kind of thing out. Unless, how is your file upload doing? It's saying 3 hours, about 3 hours ago. I wonder if it's now uploaded. Okay, I'm just going to drop the materials into the bottom of the chat, just so they are the last thing we record. So I'll pop the PD tutorials into there. The VCV tutorials, all of which have a video of the making of, if you like, there. And then the files for all of today. Can go in there. Okay, so what I'm going to finish with is, I think, perhaps giving you some time to maybe chat about um, your second assignment with me. You obviously don't have to kind of finalize what you want to do, but it's probably a good use of the time. And I'll add in afterwards the stuff that compares hardware to software, so you can kind of see how the software is modeled on hardware rather than try and do it live, because it's really awkward to kind of deal with two cameras and so on live. And we might be better off talking about your assignments. Um, what I'm going to do is move to Teams so we can chat there individually or as a group for the next hour. If you want to ask anything about your second assignment, whether you want to tell me what you've done so far, and we can start thinking about ideas for assignment 2. Let me just create the Teams thing, and I'll pop the link into the chat. Just give me a moment to set Teams up. Okay, I'm just going to close my camera view just so I can get Teams up and running, and then I'll pop the Teams link into here. You don't have to talk about your second assignment, but if you want to, we've got an hour or so to do that, just under.